Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today, let's talk some standard best of one. Let's talk about the best decks in standard best of one. This is your weekly meta update. Every week, we cover the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder for every format in the client. We look at best of one. We look at best of three. If you're looking at Historic, Explorer, Alchemy, Standard, check out the playlist. We cover them each week. You can always find your best lists here. So make sure to follow the channel if you're not subscribing. It'll let you know if you need your deck lists. If you want to go to the top to Mythic, this is definitely the place to do it. So we are, as always, getting the data from Untapped GG. It's a companion tool that runs alongside Arena's client. So it'll track your win rate, so you can get a bunch of cool win rate stats for yourself. And then it combines it with all the other users. It gives us a whole bunch of cool stats in terms of meta distribution, win rates, popularity, trends over time, card information. So if you want to get started with Untapped, the link is in the video description. I'll paste all these deck lists, timestamp them. You can jump ahead, take the list you want. You can listen to my kind of summary explaining the deck, up to you, but this is a resource that you can leverage every week. So we are going to be looking at the last week from Diamond to Mythic. So we are going to be looking, for July 1st through the 8th. But just starting off with the popularity of the day. So what we started doing was looking at which are the most played decks, not necessarily the most winning decks. And we'll see that in a couple examples in terms of decks having high popularity, but not necessarily correlating to a high win rate. Sometimes people just play decks, there's budget constraints. Could just be like, I enjoy this, I play a couple games and go from there. So in terms of the most popular decks, 1 and 3 are both mono red decks. The burn deck usually being a little bit more geared towards mechanized warfare, as opposed to the mono red aggro, which is more of a creature oriented build. We have mono white humans sandwiched in between. So 3 double-digit percentages. Then we also have Selesnya enchantments just under the borderline, under 10%. And then we see a pretty stark drop-off in terms of volume of games played. So we have Azorius Control, mono black midrange, 5-color domain or Atraxa ramp, and then mono black control. Mono black midrange, mono black control are generally fairly similar in terms of archetypes. There are usually some deviations just in terms of the number of creatures, evolve sleepers versus the number of higher end cards. Sometimes you might see corrupt, which isn't really good. But if we kind of look at trends, we've seen an uptick over the last week of the mono red burn. So we've seen it at about 10%, upwards of 16 to 17%. Similarly, the enchantment decks, which was very hot for a while, in the double digits, around 10. We've seen it drop as low as 8, and it's kind of been hovering around that since. So all interesting kind of stats to look at as we go. But the top performing deck in terms of win rate itself, not even on the radar, folks. This is where we kind of come in and we show a deck can win games, but not necessarily be heavily played. And that's Gruul Aggro, Gruul Modify, Gruul Samut. So it's generally, and this version, we've seen these Gruul decks, which are historically just Samut decks that are mono red. But this one's kind of leaning more into the Modify theme. So Samut's very powerful in the effect that it gives you a way to draw cards in a color pair that doesn't normally draw cards. So First Strike, Vigilance, Haste for 3 mana. Whenever a creature you control steals combat damage, if that creature entered the battlefield this turn, you draw a card. So it gives you all your haste threats an ability to kind of draw cards for the turn. So you have things like Reckless Stormseeker with haste and can give your other creatures haste. Squeeze, Halana and Alana gives your other creatures haste. And then you have Kumano when it flips for that turn. It enters the battlefield because it gets exiled and returns as a flip, so that counts. You have Phoenix Chick as a way. You have Rabid Battery that can give your other creatures haste. It's Tamio Safekeeping for protection. Some copies of Ozolith the Shattered Spire. So this is kind of like a hardened scale style ability. If you put a counter, you put that many +1 instead. And then you could tap 2 mana and put a counter at the sorcery speed. And then since this is a legendary artifact, you have the ability to cycle if needed. You have Quirion Beastcaller, which gets bigger when other creatures get cast. And then when it dies, you get to redistribute those 1/1 counters. Rada's Firebrand can get rid of blockers, which is nice. And then the Voldaren Thrillseeker. This is kind of a neat way. You can make really big creatures, but you don't normally have a way to give trample in this deck. There's not like Omnath being played, for example. But with the Thrill Seeker, you can put some counters on it and give it its backup ability to sacrifice this creature and kind of fling it. So it's kind of like fling at home. You just staple on the ability for the turn. So if you have like a big Beast Caller, you can attack for the turn and then fling it at your opponent. So interesting kind of shell there. We then go to Azorius Control. So this was on the radar, but towards the bottom, but it does have a fairly high win rate, 59%. Generally, best of one formats will gravitate towards one of kind of three extremes. You have either extremely linear aggro, what we see in like the mono red decks, the mono white humans, this like Gruul deck, trying to kill your opponent by turn 4, maybe 5 the latest. You then have dedicated hard control, which is trying to say no a lot of different ways. And then you have in some formats like linear combo. Think of in like Historic, you have Belcher. In Explorer, you have Greasefang. Like things that are just like, I'm going to do my thing. Hopefully you don't interact, or I can just kill you before then. So this is kind of on that pillar of being control. So bunch of sweepers, Sunfall, Farewell, just miserable cards to play against. You have Lay Down Arms, Soul Partition as cheap removal. Farmhand helps you find access to lands. You play in a bunch of basics, helps you find those. Make Disappear for a way to have early counterspell. Also, you can just like sack your farmhand to get the extra ability. You have Jace Perfected Mind to mill your opponents, draw you cards, or kind of just lock down one of their attackers. Memory Deluge for card advantage, as well as Thrill for discovery, and then your Wandering Emperor. The one thing that you may want to consider for this type of deck that's usually pretty decent in some of these control decks is a copy of the Myrex. Generally, you'll kind of wear out the resources, the games go long, and it just adds some redundancy in terms of the match itself. You'll notice with the mana base here, you have access to Triomes. This is on purpose because Lay Down Arms counts the number of planes you control. So these are effectively blue-white duels that have the basic land type planes. So that counts for Lay Down Arms ability. Jumping over, we go to mono white humans. So we've seen some variations of this archetype, but it's generally around the kind of core of Coppercoat Vanguard, giving a boost to your humans in terms of power. Adeline, Brutal Cathar, usually your 3-drops. You sometimes see some of the other 3-drops, the like the tax one for 3 mana, the Vigilance. But this one's on like Knight Errant. This one's playing a little bit of removal in the main in terms of ossification. You have 1-drops and Hopeful Initiate, as well as Recruitment Officer for card advantage. Skrell for protection, so not a human, but protects your important humans. Thalia for tax. Intrepid Adversary is kind of a Lord effect, and a single copy of Guardian of New Benalia mixed in. Very clean mana base. We got planes, we got Inaganjo, and that's leading to a 58% win rate. We then pop over to mono red aggro. So again, this is the creature version of the deck. I'll pull up like a burn version just for comparison as well. But for the creature version, generally they have some number of Squeeze and Raiju. This deck in the past has played 4 of both of these, but opting to trim the numbers down and play Furnace Rains. We've also seen sometimes 21, 22, 23 lands. This version, since skipping a little bit on the top end of the curve, is going with Furnace Rains, and then a little bit more in terms of the 1-drops. This helps the deck against some of the bigger creatures, gets like Shieldred out of the way, can get rid of like anything that's kind of like even an Adeline sometimes. If you steal their Adeline, you can like force an attack. So it's a nice way to catch your opponent, maybe sleeping in that regard. You got Burn with Lightning Strike, Strangle, and Play with Fire. A bunch goes face, some could kill creatures. Then you have Reinforced Ronin as something that dodges the sweepers. So against like Azorius Control, they need instant speed removal against it. Phoenix Chicks, Swiftspears, Kumanos, the usual suspects. Bloodthirsty flashes back all your instants and sorceries in the deck, and then Felton in that regard. Let me pull up a burn list for comparison purposes. So we will hop over. So the burn version is usually the difference of having mechanized warfare. So the configuration, while there are some similarities, there is some differences. So you still have your Squeeze, you still have your Play with Fires, Phoenix Chicks, Swiftspears, Kumanos. This version's playing End the Festivities. So End the Festivities is kind of a one-sided board wipe in this deck against some of like the more linear aggro decks. So again, think against like mono white humans, they have a lot of X1s, But with Mechanized Warfare, each iteration of Warfare that you have out adds an extra damage. So 2 damage each creature, 3 damage each creature, 4 damage, whatever it may be. You have ping effects from like Voldaren Aperture that also do scalable damage with the Warfares out, and then a couple copies of Reckless Impulse for card advantage. Single copy of Mishra's Foundry and Ahsoka Zen in the mana base. So we see both these mono red decks are very well played, but they are a little bit lower than some of these other decks. They're all kind of bunched into that like high to mid 50s. We've seen some past weeks where these numbers have been in like the mid 60s. And in some formats, we sometimes see them in like the 65s to 70s if it's really over the top deck. We then jump to Naya Humans. So this is a kind of take on the mono white deck that's splashing for some very powerful non-white humans or kind of multicolor humans. So Halana and Alana, as we mentioned in the Gruul modified deck, allows you to haste out creatures, put counters on it, makes them really big. You have Sigarda, Champion of Light, that can give you a boost to your humans, a Lord effect that can also provide you some card advantage should you have Coven out, which is nice, so just some card advantage. We've also seen in some instances of this deck, the Aftermath Sigarda also get played. Gives all your creatures hexproof, and I think lets you cast off the top of your library, if I'm not mistaken. So depending if you open, I've seen some configurations, might be something worth trying out. The rest of the deck, we see similar 1-drops, similar 2-drops in there, but we also have access to Malara, the Living Cure. So Poison's not like super played on the ladder the last little bit, but if you run into Poison, it's kind of a trump there, but it's more for the second ability. You could basically say they try to kill your Adeline, you could sack your Malara, and then get your Adeline back. So it kind of preserves your best creature in that respect. A couple copies of Valor's Stance can also do a similar thing of giving your creature indestructible. Notably, indestructible does not play around exile. Or it can destroy a big toughness creature. So Shield Druids, your opponent's Adeline, anything of that nature. You're casting these legends through Plaza of the Heroes, Secluded Courtyard. Also can be used as protection, and then some more dual lands in there. And lastly, I'm just going to mention it, and we'll probably just kind of highlight it here quick too, but if we look at the meta distribution, we see Mono Black and Selesnya in particular, being played at 10% win rate, but in the last week, it's got a like 48% win rate. With the increase, so I played this deck a lot. I got 2 months ago, I got top 1200 with it. I think it was 2 months ago. I was something like 80% win rate. Last month I was trying to play it and I could barely break like 53 to 55%. The shift of a lot of decks after the ban to white-based exile is very rough for this deck. So the difference between this deck being like an aggressive deck and like mono red and stuff, this does have elements of synergy where individual cards aren't as powerful on their own. Compared to like mono red has a lot of reach, so you don't have to necessarily commit all your resources to the board. The only way this deck is going to deal damage to your opponent is by playing cards out, which naturally gets you closer to getting hit by things like Sunfall. Because this is a synergy deck, you want to play things out that then also unfortunately get hit by that. So it tends to be a little bit slower, but can like generally outscale the aggro mirrors. But the problem is too, like if you look at mono red, they're now playing 12 1-2 mana removal spells, which can catch a lot of these creatures. Also, a lot of the removal is exile, so something like Kami of Transience, which should in theory be good against a lot of removal, is not as good when your opponent's playing a lot of exile-based effects. Similarly, like things like Weaver of Harmony is a little slow in that respect. Because generally, like your best curves are at times like Generous Visitor into Jukai, into maybe like Calyx, another card. But they're all fairly like weak on their own until you get the ball rolling. This deck also tends to lack a bit of card advantage. So once you've gone through your initial kind of burst of effect, you're really reliant on like Spirited Companion or the top of your deck. And sometimes it's just not kind. I've played Wedding Announcement in the past in this deck as a way to kind of get virtual draw. I've played Hallowed Haunting versions as well. Again, they're a little bit slow, the Hallowed Haunting versions, into like heavily mono red based meta. You can play the vampires, like the 2-mana exile, like the vampire one. That does help, but then you run into like the case where you have a bunch of those in the hand and you're playing against, say, blue-white control, which doesn't really have targets for it. So we've seen that kind of drop off. Additionally, we've seen a decrease, like the mono black control deck, 48%. So these are decks that are seeing some amount of play, but just not performing well in that regard. So that's it for the week. Let me know what you think, what you've been playing, what you've been enjoying. As I mentioned on the onset, subscribing to the channel goes a long way, helps me out, costs you nothing. Same with liking and commenting. You'll see at the bottom left. We're trying to hit 10,000 subs on the channel. So if you like this content, if you found it helpful, hit that sub button. We're just a little over 9,200 right now, trying to hit 10K. I was hoping the end of June, but let's say end of July. If we can hit that, that would be an awesome stretch goal for like midsummer. In any case, thanks for watching. Hope you have a great one and stay safe out there.